4 million humans are gone. The Dominion systems are failing. And now the first jump corridor has gone dark. The galaxy is finally realizing humanity was never just labor. They were the foundation.
The vote ended in applause. Not nervous applause. Not uncertain applause. The kind that came from powerful people congratulating themselves for making history without having to bleed for it. Across the circular chamber of the Dominion Senate, hundreds of delegates rose from their illuminated platforms while holographic banners unfurled above them in waves of silver light. The words custodial species ACT glowed in massive letters across the vaulted ceiling as cameras drifted through the air, broadcasting the moment to 14,000 inhabited systems. Humanity had just lost its sovereignty. Officially, the act was described as an administrative stabilization initiative. The language had been polished for nearly 7 years by legal counsels and economic analysts who understood the importance of making change sound civilized. Humanity would no longer operate as an independent interstellar species. Human labor, infrastructure, transport, engineering, logistics, and military consultation services would now fall under direct Dominion supervision for the continued prosperity of galactic society. Most species called it integration. The humans called it ownership. But no human protested. That was the first thing Senator Talvin noticed. The observer gallery above the chamber held exactly 52 human representatives, and during the entire 6-hour session not one of them had interrupted, argued, or attempted to stall the proceedings. They had simply sat there in perfect stillness while species after species discussed humanity the way merchants discuss power grids or shipping costs. Talvin had expected outrage. Humans were famous for outrage. The species had built half its reputation on emotional unpredictability and stubborn resistance. They fought wars they could not win. They defended worlds long after surrender became logical. They carried grudges across generations and called it principle. But tonight, nothing. No anger. No desperation. Just silence. And somehow that silence disturbed him more than rebellion would have. The High Chancellor finally lifted both arms for order as the applause began to settle. "Effective immediately," she declared, her amplified voice echoing through the chamber. "All human-operated infrastructure within Dominion territory shall be transferred under provisional administrative authority pending integration review." More applause followed. Talvin joined it automatically, though his eyes kept drifting upward toward the gallery. The humans were standing now. Not hurriedly, not dramatically. Together. 52 individuals rising at the exact same moment without visible coordination. A woman near the center collected a thin black tablet from a seat and slipped it beneath her arm. Another adjusted the sleeve of his gray uniform. One older man paused long enough to place his identification badge carefully onto the railing before turning toward the exit. No one looked back. The chamber doors opened, and the humans walked out in total silence. Something cold moved through Talvin's stomach. Around him, delegates were already celebrating trade advantages and labor reallocations. Some discussed how quickly human industries could now be optimized under centralized control. Others laughed openly about finally civilizing the species that had spent decades becoming indispensable to the Dominion economy. Yet Talvin barely heard them, because a woman with a black tablet had smiled before leaving. Not a defeated smile. Not bitter. Certain. 11 minutes later, the first station went dark. At first, nobody understood what had happened. The orbital traffic ring above Siren Prime simply stopped moving. Thousands of cargo vessels froze in designated approach lanes while automated docking systems rebooted simultaneously across the station network. Then the communication relays failed. Then the navigation lattice desynchronized. And then, across 3 separate military sectors, Dominion warships lost access to their jump route calculations at the exact same second. Inside the Senate chamber, celebration turned into confusion as emergency notifications flooded delegate consoles faster than security systems could process them. Talvin stared at the alerts appearing across his display. Cargo grid failure. Human override not found. Translation network offline. Infrastructure authorization revoked. A cold murmur spread through the chamber. Someone demanded military intervention. Someone else shouted about cyber attacks. Then a communications officer near the central dais suddenly went pale. "Chancellor," she whispered. The room quieted. The officer looked down at her screen again, as if hoping the words would change. "They are gone." "Who's gone?" the Chancellor snapped. The officer swallowed hard. "All of them." Across Dominion territory, over 4 million humans had vanished in less than 12 minutes. Not missing. Gone. Factories still running had no human staff inside them. Engineering districts stood empty. Human military advisors disappeared from command stations mid-shift. Entire transport crews abandoned vessels in perfect operational condition. Apartment complexes registered signs of orderly departure hours before the vote had even concluded. No riots. No attacks. No demands. Only absence. And then the final report arrived. A classified infrastructure archive buried beneath 70 years of Dominion commercial contracts had just auto-unsealed itself across every government network in existence. At the top of the file, above millions of pages of encrypted system architecture, was a single line. Emergency severance authority acknowledged. Human access required for continued operation. The Dominion spent the first 6 hours lying to itself. Official broadcast called the disappearances temporary labor disruptions. Economic analysts assured the public that human workers represented convenience, not necessity. Military officials promised that every interrupted system would be restored within the cycle. Calm voices repeated calm words across every surviving channel in the Empire. But deep beneath the Senate complex on Siren Prime, where emergency operations teams had begun tearing through infrastructure archives, panic had already started spreading among people intelligent enough to understand what they were looking at. Because the systems were not broken, they were refusing access. Senior Systems Director Viol Tone stood inside Control Nexus 4, surrounded by hundreds of floating displays, each one flashing the same impossible message in different forms. Authorization incomplete. Primary maintenance signature unavailable. Human clearance required. Viol's 4 hands moved rapidly across the interface while technicians shouted around him in escalating frustration. Bypass the authentication layers. One demanded. We already tried. Another snapped back. Then force administrative control. There is no administrative control. That answer silenced the room for half a second. Viol zoomed in on the station's navigation core, expecting sabotage, hidden malware, encryption traps, anything recognizable. Instead, what he found disturbed him far more. The humans had documented everything. Every maintenance cycle, every software revision, every operational parameter. The records were immaculate, organized with obsessive precision. Nothing had been hidden, and yet none of it explained how the systems actually worked. It was like reading instructions written by someone who assumed the reader already understood concepts they had never bothered to teach. "How is this possible?" a junior technician whispered nearby. Viol didn't answer immediately, because he was beginning to understand something horrifying. The Dominion had spent 40 years treating human labor like background noise. Humans fixed things. Humans maintained infrastructure. Humans solved problems before problems became visible. Entire sectors had gradually stopped training specialists because human contractors were faster, cheaper, and impossibly reliable. No one had planned dependence. Dependence had simply become convenient. A new alert flashed across Viol's display. Medical synthesis failure, Eastern cluster. Another followed seconds later. Atmospheric filtration delay, orbital habitat 12. Then another. Translation grid latency detected. The failures were spreading too quickly, and they were all connected to human-operated architecture. Viol opened the oldest infrastructure records he could find. Most were decades old, signed by forgotten administrators during periods of rapid Dominion expansion when humanity had still been viewed as an ambitious but secondary species eager to earn galactic approval. The contract disturbed him immediately. Human firms had accepted terrible terms. Reduced profit margins. Expanded workloads. Emergency response obligations. Infrastructure maintenance agreements that bordered on exploitative. Entire planetary support systems built for costs no rational corporation should have accepted. At first glance it looked naive. Then Viol noticed a pattern. Every contract guaranteed long-term operational dependency. Not ownership. Not control. Dependency. His throat tightened. The humans had never competed for power the way other species did. They had not conquered trade routes or dominated militarily or demanded political authority inside the Dominion Senate. They had done something quieter. They had positioned themselves beneath civilization itself. A transmission request interrupted his thoughts. The Senate Emergency Committee wanted immediate status updates. Vile almost laughed. What status? He had spent the last 2 hours discovering that the Dominion's greatest infrastructure systems operated on principles only humans fully understood. And somehow that realization was getting worse. Far worse. Across the galaxy, reports continued multiplying. Orbital elevators entered indefinite safety lockdowns because calibration teams were unavailable. Agricultural distribution hubs began misrouting shipments after logistics algorithms failed to synchronize. Military shipyard halted production because human-designed fabrication engines refused an authorized access to their own repair architecture. But the strangest part was the precision. Nothing catastrophic had happened. No reactors exploded. No civilian habitats depressurized. No hospitals lost life support. The failures were targeted with surgical restraint, disrupting efficiency instead of causing mass death. Someone had planned this carefully, very carefully. On the outer edge of mapped Dominion territory, far beyond the commercial lanes, a vessel drifted silently through interstellar darkness. It emitted no signatures, no registry beacon, no identifiable military markers. Inside the command deck, Commander Elias Vale studied the incoming reports with unreadable calm while soft blue light reflected across dozens of tactical displays. Around him, human officers monitored collapsing Dominion systems with a quiet focus of people watching prediction unfold exactly as expected. No retaliation fleets launched. One officer reported. Military coordination. Elias asked. Fragmented. They still believe this is temporary. A faint smile crossed someone else's face. They always thought the danger was what humanity could do to them, a woman near the rear station murmured. They never considered what would happen if we stopped helping. Elias said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the countdown floating above the central display. Phase 1 withdrawal. Complete. Phase 2 preparation. Active. Beside the timer rested an older file labeled simply, Severance Protocols, approved 43 years ago. One of the younger officers finally broke the silence. Do you think they understand yet? Elias leaned back slowly. No, he said. Right now they still think this is about labor. The officer frowned slightly. And it isn't. Elias looked toward the dark stars beyond the viewport. No, he answered quietly. It's about trust. That answer lingered uncomfortably in the room, because every person aboard the vessel understood what the Dominion did not. Humanity had not built its civilization around superiority. It had built it around reliability. Humans arrived first during disasters. Humans repaired systems nobody else wanted to maintain. Humans accepted dangerous contracts, impossible deadlines, collapsing colonies, forgotten trade routes, and failing infrastructure because somewhere across centuries they had convinced themselves usefulness would eventually become belonging. And now? Now, the species that spent generations holding the galaxy together had just been legally classified as property. A soft chime interrupted the silence. New transmissions flooded the hidden vessel from observation assets across Dominion space. Civil unrest rising on 3 core worlds. Military requisition delays spreading across frontier sectors. Financial systems beginning to desynchronize. And beneath all of it, something far more dangerous was beginning to emerge. Fear. Not fear of invasion, fear of ignorance. Because for the first time in modern Dominion history, entire governments were being forced to confront a terrifying possibility. They had absolutely no idea how their own civilization functioned. Elias opened another file. This one contained thousands of names. Human engineers, human architects, human logistics planners, human maintenance crews. Generations of people who had quietly become essential while the galaxy convinced itself they were replaceable. At the very bottom of the document sat a final line time-stamped 11 years earlier. If severance becomes necessary, do not interrupt Phase 3 under any circumstances. One of the officers noticed a file open on his display. What happens in Phase 3? She asked softly. Elias did not answer immediately, because outside the ship, deep within Dominion territory, the first interstellar jump corridor had just gone dark.
4 million humans are gone. The Dominion systems are failing. And now the first jump corridor has gone dark. The galaxy is finally realizing humanity was never just labor, they were the foundation.
The shutdown of Corridor 9 lasted exactly 14 minutes. That was all it took to terrify the Dominion. For 14 minutes, one of the busiest interstellar transit arteries in known space ceased to function. Thousands of civilian vessels emerged from jump space into empty coordinates because the stabilization beacons guiding them no longer aligned properly. Cargo carriers drifted without navigational confirmation. Passenger liners rerouted blindly through emergency vectors that had not been used in generations. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the corridor returned online. No explanation, no message, no demands. Only a system log stamped with a maintenance notation written in human technical shorthand. Temporary synchronization withdrawal complete. That phrase spread through military command centers like a disease, because it implied control. Not chaos, not malfunction. Control. Inside Dominion strategic operations, senior admirals gathered around a tactical projection showing the growing map of infrastructure instability across known space. Entire sectors were beginning to flicker yellow and red as secondary failures accumulated faster than emergency crews could respond. Admiral Surik Dan stared at the projection with visible disbelief. "This is impossible," he muttered. Nobody answered him, because everyone in the room knew it was not impossible anymore. The Dominion had spent decades preparing for rebellion scenarios, human insurgencies, terror attacks, fleet uprisings, colonial warfare. Every predictive model assumed humans would fight emotionally, visibly, directly. Instead, they had vanished. And somehow that was worse. A strategist near the far end of the chamber finally spoke. "We should classify this as coordinated economic warfare." Another officer shook her head immediately. Economic warfare doesn't disable military logistics without touching civilian casualty thresholds. "Then what would you call it?" The woman hesitated. Her answer came quietly. "Demonstration." That word settled heavily over the room, because demonstrations were meant to teach. Across the Dominion, the lessons were escalating. Agricultural worlds began reporting shipment corruption after automated freight systems lost access to human-designed optimization routes. Entire food convoys arrived weeks late or in the wrong systems entirely. On Kel Prime, 3 billion citizens watched store shelves empty for the first time in modern history despite the fact that supply ships technically still existed. Nobody could coordinate them correctly anymore. At the same time, emergency investigations uncovered another horrifying reality. The Dominion's navigation systems were not unified technology. They were layered technology. For decades, species after species had added their own frameworks on top of older systems without fully understanding the foundation beneath them. Human engineers had quietly become the bridge holding incompatible civilizations together, translating software, stabilizing logistics, correcting errors before anyone noticed they existed. Humanity had not merely participated in galactic civilization. Humanity had become the glue inside it, and now the glue was gone. On the Senate world of Siren Prime, Senator Talvin walked through a government district that no longer felt stable. The streets remained crowded. The towers still glowed at night. Public announcements continued reassuring citizens that recovery operations were progressing successfully, but the illusion was thinning. People moved faster now. Conversations stopped when officials passed nearby. Markets fluctuated wildly as transport reliability collapsed across multiple sectors. Emergency broadcasts interrupted entertainment streams every few hours with updated ration advisories disguised as temporary distribution adjustments. The Dominion was trying desperately to appear calm, which meant the situation was worse than publicly admitted. Talvin entered a restricted archive facility beneath the Senate complex where dozens of analysts were combing through older infrastructure agreements searching for answers humanity never bothered to explain openly, or perhaps answers the Dominion never bothered to ask for. An exhausted archivist handed Talvin a data slate without speaking. He activated it and felt his pulse slow. The file was 72 years old. A psychological projection study commissioned during humanity's earliest integration period. He skimmed the opening paragraphs quickly before stopping cold at a highlighted section. Human behavioral adaptation suggests long-term species survival strategies based on infrastructural indispensability rather than territorial dominance. Talvin frowned. Another passage caught his attention immediately after. Recommendation: monitor humanity carefully if denied equal political integration. Species demonstrates unusually high tolerance for delayed strategic preparation. His eyes narrowed. The report continued. Humans appear willing to spend generations embedding themselves into larger systems if they believe eventual rejection is probable. Talvin looked up slowly. Who wrote this? The archivist hesitated. A human sociologist. That's not possible. Why would they document this themselves? The archivist gave a weak, uncertain laugh. Maybe because they knew nobody would read it. Silence settled between them. Then another analyst across the room suddenly shouted. Everyone turned. The analyst's face had gone pale. We found the external mapping records. Talvin moved immediately toward the central display where star charts were unfolding rapidly across holographic space. At first, he didn't understand what he was seeing. Then the scale became clear. Hidden beyond official Dominion navigation borders sat hundreds of deep space supply points, communication relays, habitation clusters, industrial zones, and encrypted transit paths. Entire infrastructure networks. Independent infrastructure networks. His mouth went dry. How long has this existed? No confirmed date, the analyst whispered. But some of these stations are older than the Dominion Alliance itself. Another silence. Then someone quietly asked a question nobody wanted answered. Why would humans build civilization outside map space? No one in the archive room spoke, because every possible answer felt dangerous. Far from Siren Prime, a Dominion covert strike team breached the outer hull of an abandoned human research facility drifting near an unregistered moon. The military operation had been authorized under the assumption that the station might contain weapons development data or command infrastructure connected to the disappearances. Instead, they found empty corridors. No defenses, no bodies, no weapons, just silence. The strike commander advanced through dimly lit halls lined with inactive screens and abandoned workstations coated in a thin layer of dust. The facility looked less like a military installation and more like something carefully left behind on purpose. Then they reached the archive chamber. Rows upon rows of preserved records filled the room. Contracts, infrastructure schematics, economic forecasts, political simulations, and psychological projections. The commander activated one at random. A human voice filled the chamber instantly. If you are hearing this, the recording said calmly, the Dominion finally made a predictable decision. The strike team froze. The voice continued. We estimated the probability at 83% within the next century, faster if economic instability increased. Another screen activated automatically nearby. Then another. Soon dozens of archive projections illuminated the chamber simultaneously. Human analysts discussing species prejudice. Human economists mapping infrastructure dependency curves. Human strategists debating withdrawal ethics decades before the current crisis ever began. The commander stared in growing horror. This was not revenge planning. This was preparation. Preparation spanning generations. One final screen flickered to life at the center of the chamber. A date appeared first, 52 years earlier. Then a sentence beneath it. Phase 3 authorized upon loss of human legal personhood status. The strike commander swallowed hard. Command, one of his soldiers whispered behind him. What exactly did we do to them? Nobody answered, because at that exact moment, across Dominion territory, 17 more jump corridors went dark simultaneously. The Dominion fractured quietly at first. No declarations, no civil wars, no dramatic collapses broadcast across public channels. Just governments beginning to blame each other in rooms that suddenly felt too small. 3 days after the corridor failure spread across the core sectors, the Valorian Trade Coalition accused the Senate of withholding infrastructure recovery data. 12 hours later, the Senate accused the Military Logistics Bureau of diverting emergency resources toward protected systems. Frontier governors began refusing centralized directives altogether after transport delays left entire colonies rationing oxygen filters and water purification supplies. The unity that had once made the Dominion seem eternal was beginning to peel apart at the edges, and humanity still had not fired a single shot. Senator Talvin stood inside a transport terminal on Siren Prime watching thousands of civilians sleep on the polished station floor beneath emergency lighting. Cargo delays had trapped entire passenger sectors in orbital transit after route stabilizers failed across the inner systems. Families huddled around ration dispensers while exhausted officials repeated calm instructions nobody trusted anymore. The unsettling part was how ordinary it still looked. No riots, no burning cities, just a civilization slowly discovering how fragile normality really was. A child somewhere nearby asked her mother when the lights would stop flickering. The mother did not answer. Talvin kept walking. Every corridor monitor displayed the same official statement from Dominion leadership. Temporary disruptions remain under control. But beneath the announcement scrolled another set of numbers the government could no longer hide. Transit efficiency down 41%. Interstellar freight coordination down 62%. Medical synthesis production entering critical shortages. And those numbers were already outdated before they appeared. Inside the Senate emergency chamber, voices overlapped in furious waves as delegation leaders argued across one another with increasingly open hostility. This situation is a result of Senate overreach, one representative snapped. Oh, spare us. Another fired back immediately. Your worlds voted yes before the final draft even finished review. We voted based on economic assurances provided by your analysts. You voted because you thought humans would remain obedient. The chamber erupted again. At the center platform, High Chancellor Merovec tried unsuccessfully to restore order while tactical projections updated in real time around her. Another manufacturing sector offline. Another navigation collapse. Another emergency ration advisory. And still no response from humanity. That silence was poisoning everything now, because the Dominion could not negotiate with absence. Admiral Surik Dan watched the arguments with growing disgust. You are all missing the point. He finally growled loud enough to cut through the chamber. Several delegates turned toward him. Surik activated a new projection. The chamber quieted instantly. The display showed Dominion military readiness levels, or rather what remained of them. Fleet deployment response times had tripled. Long-range tactical coordination grids were desynchronizing faster than engineers could compensate. Autonomous defense satellites across 6 systems were entering safety lockdowns because human-written authentication layers could no longer verify command authority. One cluster blinked red near the edge of the map. Surik enlarged it grimly. The defense network around Kel Prime no longer recognizes Dominion command signatures. A cold silence followed. One delegate blinked in confusion. What does that mean? Surik looked directly at him. It means, he said carefully, our own planetary defense systems no longer know we own them. The room erupted again, louder this time. Fear had finally entered the conversation openly. Not fear of humanity attacking. Fear of realizing the Dominion had never fully controlled its own civilization. Hours later, buried beneath layers of restricted military archives, Surik accessed files he had never bothered reading before the crisis began. Most were decades old. Human-authored technical supplements attached to defense contracts nobody in command had considered strategically important at the time. He opened one at random, and felt something cold settle in his chest. The document was not written like engineering notes. It read like a warning disguised as maintenance guidance. Complex systems fail gradually before they fail suddenly, one passage stated. Species that outsource understanding eventually mistake convenience or stability. Surik scrolled farther. Another line caught his attention. Dependency becomes invisible to those benefiting from it. His jaw tightened. The humans had known, not just about the infrastructure, about them, about the Dominion itself. A new emergency transmission interrupted the file. Priority civilian unrest alerts were spreading across multiple systems after translation networks began malfunctioning unpredictably. Entire media broadcasts were desynchronizing between species dialects because the universal linguistic bridge layers, human-designed bridge layers, were collapsing under increasing strain. On one world, automated emergency warnings mistranslated evacuation instructions badly enough to trigger mass panic inside a commercial district. On another, military commands transmitted incorrect targeting coordinates during a border piracy response. Everywhere the same horrifying realization spread wider. Human systems were not separate from civilization. They were civilization, and then the transmission arrived. No source identification. No traceable origin. It appeared simultaneously across public networks, military frequencies, emergency channels, and civilian broadcasts in every surviving language of the Dominion. A black screen. Nothing else. For several seconds the galaxy watched in confused silence. Then white text appeared slowly across the darkness. You measured humanity by what we provided. Another line followed. You never measured what it would cost when we stopped. No threats. No demands. No declaration of war. The message vanished instantly. Across the Dominion, billions of people stared at suddenly empty screens while unease spread deeper than panic ever could. Because rage could be fought. Hatred could be resisted. But disappointment carried something colder inside it. On the hidden vessel drifting beyond mapped space, Commander Elias Vale watched the public reaction unfold through secured observation feeds. Entire governments were destabilizing faster than projected. Not because systems were collapsing, because certainty was collapsing. A younger officer near the tactical stations looked uneasy. The transmission is accelerating unrest faster than expected. Elias nodded once. It was supposed to. Another officer glanced up from her console. Military command just attempted forced activation of 3 defense grids. And they locked themselves out completely. A few restrained smiles appeared around the room, but Elias did not smile. His attention remained fixed on another incoming report. Civilian infrastructure stress indexes were rising more rapidly than anticipated near several outer colonies. Human withdrawal had been designed carefully to avoid mass casualty events. But civilizations built on invisible dependency did not collapse neatly. They cracked unpredictably. One of the officers noticed his expression. Do you think we should slow phase fall? Elias remained silent for a long moment. Outside the viewport, distant stars drifted across endless darkness. 43 years of preparation. 43 years building redundancies, hidden supply chains, independent colonies, severance contingencies. All because humanity had feared this exact moment long, before the Dominion believed it possible. Finally he spoke. No, he said quietly. The officer frowned slightly. Why not? Elias looked back toward the tactical displays where another wave of Dominion infrastructure failures was beginning to spread. Because they still think this is retaliation, he answered. The room fell silent. And somewhere deep within Dominion territory, the first planetary power grid entered irreversible shutdown. The blackout on Vera Prime lasted 9 minutes. 9 minutes without power should not have mattered on the wealthiest world in the Dominion. The capital planet possessed enough backup infrastructure to survive meteor impacts, military sieges, even orbital catastrophes. Entire districts had redundant systems layered beneath redundant systems. And yet when the central grid failed, everything failed with it. Transportation froze between skyscraper levels. Climate systems shut down inside luxury towers. Emergency medical networks lost synchronization. Automated security barriers locked millions of citizens inside transit sectors that suddenly had no light except the distant glow of stars outside reinforced glass. For 9 minutes, the richest world in known space experienced helplessness. Then the backup systems activated. But the fear remained. Because the investigation uncovered something impossible. The power grid itself had not malfunctioned. The human-designed stabilization architecture beneath it had simply stopped cooperating. That wording appeared in the final report submitted to the Senate Emergency Committee. One exhausted engineer had typed it before realizing how absurd it sounded. Stop cooperating. As though the systems possessed intention. As though the Dominion civilization had spent decades resting on a foundation it never truly owned. Inside the increasingly fractured Senate chamber, arguments had evolved into accusations openly bordering on collapse. Delegates who once voted together now sat separated into defensive clusters while emergency updates poured across the central projection faster than aides could catalog them. Entire commercial sectors were freezing. Trade routes no longer functioned predictably. Interstellar recovery costs had exceeded military wartime expenditures within 12 days, and humanity still remained invisible. No fleet sightings, no territorial claims, no demands for surrender, only calculated absence. Senator Talvin sat silently through the chaos while reviewing another recovered archive from the abandoned human facilities discovered beyond Dominion borders. The files disturbed him more each time he opened them, not because they contained threats, because they contained restraint. One document after another detailed decades of human internal debates about integration, labor dependency, political discrimination, and long-term species vulnerability. Thousands of pages showed human analysts arguing against severance plans for generations despite repeated warnings that the Dominion's treatment of humanity would eventually become dangerous. Talvin stopped at a passage written 31 years earlier by an unnamed human strategist. If separation becomes necessary, it must not become revenge. The objective is survival through withdrawal, not dominance through destruction. His eyes narrowed. Another line followed beneath it. If we build systems the Dominion cannot survive without, then one day we must also decide whether we are willing to let them fail. Talvin leaned back slowly. For the first time since the crisis began, he realized something that frightened him more than collapse. Humanity never wanted this. That changed everything. Across hidden relay stations outside mapped territory, human communication networks pulsed silently between colonies the Dominion had never known existed. Not military fortresses, not war fleets. Civilizations. Entire human civilizations. Commander Elias Vale walked through one of them now beneath a simulated sky glowing with artificial twilight. Streets filled with markets, schools, transit systems, residential towers, and gardens stretched across kilometers of rotating habitat architecture hidden deep inside a hollowed asteroid cluster far beyond official navigation routes. Children ran through public squares laughing while supply transports drifted overhead. Life. Normal life. Not refugees hiding from the Dominion. People already free from it. A council member joined Elias near the observation platform overlooking the habitat below. The latest projections arrived, she said quietly. Elias accepted the data slate without speaking. The numbers confirmed what they already suspected. The Dominion stabilization curve was deteriorating exponentially. Entire sectors were beginning to cannibalize emergency resources from one another. Political alliances were collapsing into localized survival prioritization. And perhaps most dangerously, civilian populations were starting to ask questions their governments could no longer answer honestly. How much of our civilization belonged to humanity? The answer, unfortunately, appeared to be almost all of it. You still think they can recover? The council member asked. Elias looked down at the habitat beneath them, at families eating together beneath warm lights, at children growing up in places humanity built quietly while the Dominion debated whether humans deserved equal rights. Then he answered honestly. Yes, he said, but not as the same civilization. The woman studied him carefully. You sound disappointed. Maybe I am. Far across Dominion territory, Admiral Surik Dan received a report that finally shattered the remaining illusion of control. Interstellar gate stabilization systems were beginning to destabilize permanently. At first, military command assumed it was another temporary withdrawal event like the earlier corridor failures. But the engineers analyzing the network discovered something far worse. The stabilization systems were aging. Human maintenance had hidden the deterioration for decades through constant calibration adjustments nobody else understood. Without those adjustments, the gate network itself would begin failing sector by sector until faster-than-light travel across Dominion territory became impossible. Surik read the report twice, then a third time. Projected timeline estimates appeared beneath the analysis. 4 months before major transit unreliability, 9 months before large-scale collapse, 3 years before complete fragmentation of the interstellar network. The Dominion would survive physically, but its civilization would die. The ruralization spread upward through military leadership with terrifying speed, not because humanity was destroying the galaxy, because humanity had quietly been holding together all along. Hours later, another human transmission appeared across public channels. This time there was no black screen, only an image, a pair of human hands repairing an exposed power conduit somewhere inside an unidentified station. The hands looked tired, scarred, ordinary. Then text appeared beneath the image. You called U.S. essential when things broke. You called U.S. property when they worked. The transmission ended. Across billions of screens, silence followed. And for the first time since the crisis began, the Dominion public stopped asking how to defeat humanity. They began asking why humanity ever stayed. That question spread faster than panic ever had. Citizens began uncovering stories governments never bothered preserving. Human engineers volunteering during plague outbreaks. Human transport crews rescuing stranded colonies during solar storms. Human labor teams rebuilding failing sectors no Dominion corporation considered profitable enough to save. The more people looked backward, the worse the present became. Because humanity had not risen through conquest. Humanity had earned trust, and the Dominion had answered that trust with ownership. Inside the Senate, High Chancellor Merovec finally authorized emergency diplomatic outreach beyond official channels. The response arrived 4 hours later. A single document transmitted from an untraceable source. No threats, no negotiation terms, just a list. Thousands upon thousands of interconnected Dominion systems categorized beneath one terrifying heading. Human-maintained civilization index. Every power grid, every logistics network, every medical synthesis chain, every stabilization relay, every atmospheric regulator, every communications bridge. At the bottom of the document sat one final note. Severance Phase 4 will begin in 72 hours. This is a final courtesy warning. Senator Talvin read the message in stunned silence. Then his eyes stopped on the timestamp attached beneath it. The warning had not been sent from outside Dominion territory. It originated from inside the Senate complex itself. The realization spread through the Senate like poison. Someone inside the government was helping humanity. Security forces sealed the Senate complex within minutes of discovering the transmission origin, but the response only. Accelerated panic, already spreading through political core. Every delegate suddenly looked suspicious. Every aide became a potential collaborator. Emergency interrogations began before evidence existed, and within hours multiple intelligence divisions were actively working against each other while infrastructure failures continued multiplying across the Dominion unchecked. Humanity had not merely destabilized systems. They had destroyed certainty. Senator Talvin stood inside a secured observation chamber overlooking the Senate district as transport lanes below flickered with intermittent power loss. Entire towers were dim now, sections of the capital world operating under rolling energy restrictions that would have been unthinkable 2 weeks earlier. The frightening part was how quickly people adapted. Citizens carried emergency lights openly now. Businesses shortened operational hours voluntarily. Public gatherings grew smaller. Supply shortages became normal enough that conversations no longer stopped when ration updates appeared across citywide broadcasts. Civilizations did not collapse dramatically at first. They learned to survive deterioration. A soft chime interrupted Talvin's thoughts. Another emergency briefing. He almost ignored it. Instead, he turned back toward the central chamber where exhausted officials were already gathering around updated projections of the gate stabilization crisis. The map looked worse this time. Entire sectors along the outer trade lanes had turned dark red. Admiral Seric Dan addressed the room without ceremony. We confirmed permanent destabilization progression across 27 interstellar corridors, he said grimly. At current rates, civilian travel between several outer systems will become impossible within 80 days. Murmurs spread instantly. One delegate rose sharply. Then deploy military engineers. We already have. And Sarek looked directly at him. They can't understand the architecture. Silence. Again and again, the Dominion kept returning to the same impossible wall. Not sabotage. Ignorance. A junior systems analyst activated another report with visibly shaking hands. There's more. Nobody in the room looked prepared to hear those words anymore. The analyst swallowed hard before continuing. The gate network isn't the only system destabilizing. We've identified synchronization degradation inside civilian communications, long-range freight automation, atmospheric balancing systems, orbital positioning arrays, and... Enough, someone whispered. But the analyst kept going because stopping would not change reality. Most of the Dominion's core infrastructure relies on human adaptive correction layers. The systems weren't designed to operate independently long-term. Humans have been manually compensating for structural drift for decades. A terrible understanding settled across the chamber. The Dominion had mistaken maintenance for automation. All this time, they believed civilization sustained itself because humans made the sustaining invisible. Far beyond map space, Elias Vale watched the collapsed metrics rise across secured observation feeds while hidden human settlements continued functioning with calm efficiency. That contrast disturbed him more than the numbers themselves. Human worlds were stable, not because they possessed superior technology, because they understood their own systems. Children still attended school. Cargo shipments still arrived on schedule. Medical centers still operated normally. Entire populations lived without fear because humanity had spent generations preparing for self-sufficiency while the Dominion built convenience on top of dependence. A younger council officer approached quietly beside him. Civilian unrest had spread into the core sectors. Elias nodded faintly. Public footage was already flooding independent networks. Crowded ration lines, emergency blackouts, isolated colonies pleading for transport access as gate reliability deteriorated. Political riots erupting after leaked Senate recordings revealed officials privately knew the crisis was worsening faster than public statements admitted. The Dominion was not dying from infrastructure collapse anymore. It was dying from betrayal. Another transmission request appeared across Elias's display. Priority Archive release proposal. He stared at it silently. "Do it," he said at last. Hours later, every surviving public network in Dominion space received another anonymous human data burst. This one contained no warnings, only records, thousands of records. Emergency rescue operations led by human crews abandoned by Dominion funding agencies. Human engineering teams volunteering in plague zones after local governments withdrew support. Human transport workers delivering medical supplies into quarantine sectors no military fleet considered strategically valuable enough to save. The oldest file dated back nearly a century. One by one, forgotten stories spread across the galaxy. Humans rebuilding colony infrastructure after solar disasters. Humans stabilizing famine worlds. Humans repairing failing atmospheric processes while Dominion corporations argued over contract pricing. Again and again the same pattern emerged. Humanity had held civilization together long, before civilization acknowledged humanity mattered. And then came the final archive, a private Senate recording from 11 years earlier. The chamber inside the recording looked younger, less frightened, more arrogant. Talvin felt sick the moment he recognized several delegates still serving today. A voice echoed through the old session. Their dependency profile makes them economically manageable. Another voice laughed softly. They'll complain, then they'll adapt. They always do. The recording ended there. No commentary, no manipulation, just the truth. Across the Dominion, billions watched it simultaneously, and something shifted. Until that moment, many civilians still believed the crisis was a tragic misunderstanding spiraling out of control. Now they understood. Humanity had not abandoned the Dominion without reason. Humanity had been cornered there. The public reaction exploded instantly. Protests spread across dozens of systems demanding full restoration of human sovereignty. Several frontier governors publicly condemned the Custodial Species Act. Military recruitment numbers crashed after leaked reports confirmed defense networks depended almost entirely on inaccessible human infrastructure. For the first time since the crisis began, fear inside the Senate changed direction. Not fear of humanity, fear of their own people. Then the attack happened. The extremist faction called Pure Dominion had remained mostly irrelevant until now, a political fringe movement obsessed with species supremacy and anti-human propaganda. But collapsing civilizations create desperate believers, and desperation turns fringe ideologies dangerous quickly. Without Senate authorization, Pure Dominion forces launch a covert strike against one of the newly discovered human settlements beyond mapped territory. The operation lasted 4 minutes. No survivors returned. The few fragmented transmissions recovered from the attacking fleet spread through military intelligence like nightmare fuel. Human defensive systems reacting faster than targeting computers could track. Entire warships disabled mid-attack without visible weapons fire. Navigation systems overwritten remotely. Then silence. Complete silence. Hours later, a final transmission emerged automatically from the destroyed fleet's emergency beacon. Not from the attackers. From the humans. The message contained only one sentence. We left to survive. Do not force U.S. to prove we can do more. When Elias Vale received confirmation of the attack, he closed his eyes for several long seconds. Around him, the command deck had fallen completely silent, because everyone understood what the Dominion had almost unleashed. One council officer finally spoke carefully. The settlements are demanding retaliation authority. Another added quietly, some of them want separation protocols finalized permanently. Elias looked toward the stars beyond the viewport. 43 years preparing for survival. 43 years ensuring humanity would never again become trapped beneath another civilization's control. And now, after all that restraint, after all that patience, the Dominion had finally done the one thing humanity feared most. It had reminded humans what they were capable of when threatened. Then a new alert appeared across the command deck. Emergency request from Siren Prime. Priority diplomatic classification. The sender identification stunned everyone in the room. High Chancellor Merovec herself was requesting direct negotiation, and attached beneath the request was something no Dominion leader had ever said publicly before. We were wrong.
The Dominion admitted it was wrong, but after everything humanity suffered, the real question is, will humans save the galaxy or leave it behind forever?
The message from High Chancellor Merovec reached every human settlement within 17 minutes. Humanity did not answer immediately. That silence terrified the Dominion more than any fleet movement could have. Across the Senate worlds, public pressure was becoming impossible to contain. Demonstrations flooded government districts demanding repeal of the Custodial Species Act, while economic failures deepened faster than recovery efforts could stabilize them. Entire colonies were beginning voluntary evacuation procedures before gate collapses trapped them permanently. Emergency resource conflict between sectors had already caused armed confrontations along multiple trade corridors, and hanging over all of it was the same unbearable truth. Humanity could stop this whenever it wanted. That knowledge poisoned every political conversation, remaining inside the Dominion, because it transformed humanity from laborious into something much more dangerous. Necessary. Inside a secured Senate bunker beneath Siren Prime, Chancellor Merovec sat across from military leaders who looked far older than they had 3 weeks earlier. The emergency chamber no longer resembled the center of galactic power. Half the displays operated intermittently. Backup lighting cast pale shadows across exhausted faces. Even the air circulation systems hummed unevenly now. Civilization itself sounded tired. Admiral Surik Dan activated the latest tactical report with grim silence. The pure Dominion strike has collapsed what remains of centralized military cohesion, he said. Several frontier defense fleets are refusing Senate directives outright. Merovec closed her eyes briefly. How many? Enough. That answer carried more weight than numbers. Another official leaned forward urgently. We should publicly condemn the attack again. We already did. Then do it harder. Surik looked disgusted. You think statements matter anymore? Nobody answered him, because everyone understood the deeper problem now. The Dominion had spent decades believing humans were too useful to resist exploitation, and now humanity had become too powerful to control. A systems advisor suddenly interrupted the silence. Another gate cluster just destabilized. Merovec looked up sharply. Which one? Orion Passage. The room froze. Orion Passage connected 8 heavily populated sectors containing nearly 90 billion civilians. If the corridor collapsed permanently, evacuation logistics alone would become impossible within weeks. The advisor swallowed hard before continuing. We're also receiving reports that civilian populations are beginning to abandon Senate authority entirely in some outer systems. Local governments are opening direct communication requests toward human settlements. Not asking for surrender, not demanding retaliation, begging. Far beyond Dominion territory, representatives from dozens of hidden human civilizations gathered inside the assembly ring, a massive circular chamber suspended at the center of a rotating habitat older than most Senate worlds. The room was divided, not politically, emotionally. Some delegates demanded permanent severance from the Dominion forever. Others argued humanity could not abandon trillions of civilians to infrastructure collapse regardless of what their governments had done. And beneath every argument lingered the same dangerous question. What did humanity actually owe the galaxy anymore? Commander Elias Vale stood silently near the outer observation wall listening while voices rose around him. They enslaved us legally, one delegate snapped. They reduced our species to administrative property. And civilians didn't vote for that. Another countered immediately. They benefited from it. So did we once. The room erupted again. Elias remained quiet, not because he lacked opinions, because he understood the true danger sitting beneath the debate. Humanity had prepared 43 years for survival, but not for victory. That distinction mattered now. A council representative near the center platform finally turned toward Elias directly. "You designed the severance protocols," she said. "Tell us honestly, if we reconnect stabilization support, can the Dominion recover?" Elias looked around the chamber slowly. At leaders born on hidden worlds, at descendants of engineers and laborious and forgotten human workers who spent generations building backup civilizations while hoping they would never need them. Then he answered. "Yes," he said quietly. Relief flickered briefly across several faces, until he continued. "But the Dominion that recovers won't be the same civilization that existed before." Silence settled heavily over the chamber, because everyone understood what he meant. The illusion of superiority was already dead. Hours later, something unexpected happened. A public broadcast interrupted every remaining Dominion network simultaneously. Not another human transmission. A confession. Senator Talvin appeared alone against a dark background without Senate insignia or official banners behind him. He looked exhausted, older somehow, his carefully controlled political composure stripped away by weeks of collapse. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the confidence people once associated with Dominion leadership. "We told ourselves humanity would always adapt," he began quietly. "We said humans were resilient, cooperative, practical." He paused, and what we truly meant was that we believed they would endure humiliation indefinitely because their usefulness made us comfortable. Across the Dominion, billions watched in stunned silence. Talvin continued. "We call them essential while depending on them completely. We call them partners while denying them equality. And when we finally feared how necessary they had become, we chose ownership instead of gratitude." Inside the Senate bunker, several officials stared at the broadcast in horror. Merovec did not stop it. Talvin looked directly into the camera. "The collapse surrounding us is not revenge. That is a lie we tell ourselves so we can remain victims in our own minds. Humanity is not destroying civilization." His voice tightened slightly. "They are showing us who was holding it together." The transmission spread farther than any propaganda campaign remaining in the Dominion, because people recognized truth when they heard it spoken without defense. Protests intensified immediately afterward, but something about them had changed. The anger was no longer directed primarily at humanity. It was directed inward, at governments, at institutions, at decades of arrogance disguised as order. Then another message arrived from humanity. Short, direct, no theatrics. "The Assembly will hear the Chancellor." One sentence beneath it followed seconds later. One representative only. No military escort. No conditions. The Senate bunker fell silent after reading it, because everyone understood what the invitation actually meant. Humanity was still willing to talk, which meant the future had not closed yet. 3 hours later, Chancellor Merovec boarded a small diplomatic vessel alone. No guards, no advisors, no fleet support. As the ship departed Siren Prime, millions watched through public broadcasts while emergency systems flickered across the skyline behind her. The symbolism was impossible to miss. The most powerful leader in the Dominion was traveling unprotected into human-controlled space because a civilization no longer possessed leverage strong enough to demand safety. Far beyond the collapsing trade routes, hidden human defense systems tracked her vessel silently as it crossed into territory erased from official maps generations earlier. Merovec sat alone inside the transport cabin staring at the stars outside the viewport. For the first time in her political life, she truly understood fear. Not fear of death, fear of irrelevance, fear that humanity had already moved beyond the Dominion emotionally, technologically, morally, and simply no longer needed the galaxy that once believed it owned them. Then the navigation system chimed softly. Destination reached. Outside the viewport, lights began appearing slowly across the darkness. Not military formations. Cities. Entire human cities suspended among the stars. Chancellor Merovec expected resentment. She expected armed guards, hostile negotiations, perhaps even carefully restrained fury hidden beneath diplomatic language. What she did not expect was grief. The assembly ring stood at the center of the hidden human civilization like a quiet answer to a question the Dominion never realized humanity had been asking for generations. Vast transparent walls revealed rotating habitats filled with life beyond them. Parks, schools, transport lines, residential towers glowing softly beneath artificial skies. People moved through those cities calmly. Children laughed in places built far from Dominion space. Entire civilizations existed here without permission from anyone. Humanity had not hidden because it was weak. Humanity had hidden because it stopped believing the galaxy would ever let it belong openly. That realization followed Merovec into the chamber itself. Hundreds of representatives watched her arrival in complete silence. No applause, no insults, no dramatic confrontation, just silence heavy with memory. Commander Elias Vale stood near the center platform waiting for her, older than the Senate record suggested, tired in a way political exhaustion could never fully imitate. Merovec looked around slowly before speaking. You built all of this while serving us. Elias answered without hesitation. No, we built this while surviving you. The words landed harder than anger would have. For a moment neither side spoke. Then Merovec did something no chancellor in Dominion history had ever done inside an official diplomatic proceeding. She bowed her head, not ceremonially, personally. We were wrong, she said quietly. The chamber remained silent. Merovec forced herself to continue anyway. We mistook patience for submission, reliability for dependence. We convinced ourselves that because humanity carried our systems willingly, you existed to carry them forever. Her voice tightened slightly. And when we feared how much we needed you, we tried to own the thing we could not replace. Somewhere inside the chamber, someone exhaled shakily. Elias studied her carefully. Do you understand what the Dominion actually lost? Merovec nodded faintly. Trust. No, Elias said. The room became still again. You lost people who wanted to help you. That hurt more than accusation ever could, because it revealed the true scale of the tragedy. For decades, humanity had not secretly plotted domination. Humanity had genuinely tried to belong. The hidden colonies, the severance protocols, the backup civilizations beyond map space, none of them were conquest plans. They were escape plans built slowly by a species terrified that usefulness would never become acceptance. And eventually, humanity had been proven right. Merovec looked around the assembly ring again, at the faces watching her, at the worlds humanity built quietly while continuing to maintain the civilization that feared them. How long, she asked softly, did you think this day would come? Elias answered honestly, long enough to prepare children for it. That sentence broke something inside the room, not dramatically, quietly, the kind of quiet that arrives when guilt finally stops arguing with itself. Hours later, negotiations began. Not surrender negotiations. Reconstruction negotiations. The difference mattered enormously. Humanity refused military control of Dominion space, refused territorial expansion, refused economic dominance clauses proposed desperately by Senate advisors trying to preserve some version of centralized authority. Instead, the Assembly demanded something much simpler. Recognition. Every human-held contract across the galaxy would be rewritten around voluntary cooperation protections. No species could ever again classify another sentient civilization as administrative property under Dominion law. Infrastructure systems would gradually reconnect only after local governments learned how the systems actually functioned instead of outsourcing understanding permanently. Humanity would help restore the galaxy, but never invisibly again. The agreements took 11 days. During those 11 days, billions across the Dominion watched human engineers return cautiously to collapsing sectors, not as labor assets, not as servants, as partners. And everywhere they arrived, people noticed things they had never noticed before. The exhaustion beneath maintenance uniforms, the complexity of systems humans repaired almost casually, the quiet, competent civilization once ignored because it became ordinary. On Vera Prime, when stabilization lights returned permanently to the central grid after weeks of controlled outages, entire city districts applauded openly as human technicians exited the transit tunnels. Not because the lights mattered most, because people finally understood who kept them on. The Custodial Species Act was formally repealed 32 days later inside the same Senate chamber where it had first passed. This time there was no celebration, no applause. The chamber felt smaller now somehow, more honest. Human representatives sat openly among the delegates rather than above them in observer galleries. Several systems that once voted enthusiastically for the act refused to send officials at all, their governments collapsing during the crisis. Others attended quietly, stripped of the certainty that once made the Dominion feel immortal. Senator Talvin stood during the repeal session with visible exhaustion carved into his face. The Dominion survives, he said slowly, because humanity chose restraint when history gave them every reason not to. No one interrupted him. We believe civilization belonged to those who ruled it, he continued. We were wrong. Civilization belongs most to those who maintain it. For once, the chamber understood the difference. The repeal passed unanimously. No applause followed, only silence. But this silence was different from the one that haunted the chamber weeks earlier. That silence had carried warning. This one carried understanding. Months later, reconstruction continued across the fractured Dominion. Some systems never fully recovered politically. Others evolved into smaller cooperative alliances rather than centralized dependency structures. Human settlements reopened limited transit routes carefully while teaching local governments how to maintain critical infrastructure independently. The process was slower, harder, less convenient, and infinitely more stable. Deep within the hidden colonies beyond mapped space, Commander Elias Vale stood alone beneath an artificial night sky watching children run through illuminated gardens while transport lights drifted overhead. The galaxy still felt fragile. Perhaps it always would. A younger officer approached beside him quietly. Do you think they learned? Elias watched the distant lights for a long moment before answering. Some of them. And the others? He smiled faintly. The others will, he said, because now they have to notice who keeps the lights on. Far beyond the colony dome, among the endless dark between stars, interstellar corridors glowed alive once more. Not because humanity rebuilt the old Dominion exactly as it had been, but because humanity chose, one final time, to help a civilization survive its own mistakes.
In the end, humanity proved true strength isn't revenge. It's choosing to save a civilization that once tried to own you.